Power built on fear is always fragile, and Drak ruled his streets by making sure no one dared to challenge him. So when his crew set their sights on Vanessa Williams, a frail black woman with cancer moving slowly through her neighborhood, they saw nothing but weakness. They laughed, shoved her, took what they wanted, and walked away, believing the story ended there. They had no idea that Vanessa's husband, Mark Williams, was a former Marine with a lifetime of combat experience and an unshakable code. He had walked away from violence once, but when he found his wife bruised and broken, there was no turning back. Now, as Drak's empire begins to crack from the inside, Mark is closing in, not with reckless fury but with the precision of a man who never lost a war. Vanessa Williams took slow, measured steps along the cracked sidewalk, pulling her coat tighter against the crisp afternoon air. The late autumn sun cast a golden glow over the neighborhood, spilling through thinning tree branches, dappling the pavement with fleeting patterns of light and shadow. It should have been comforting, but she barely felt its warmth. The world had changed since her diagnosis. Sound seemed distant, the air always a little heavier. Even the scent of the city, a mix of car exhaust, rain-damp earth, and simmering spices from corner kitchens, felt different now, less familiar, as if she were moving through a version of reality she no longer belonged to. But today, for a brief moment, she felt almost normal. The scent of fried chicken and collard greens drifted from Miss Lever's soul food restaurant, tugging at memories buried beneath the weight of the last few months. Long Sunday dinners with Mark, the clatter of plates, the rich laughter that once filled their home. Those days had felt endless, effortless, as if time itself had bent to their happiness. Now, every day was a fight, not just against the disease but against the way people looked at her, as if she were fragile, as if she had already begun to disappear. A child's laughter rang out from a nearby yard, bright and untamed, a sound so alive that it cut through the fog in her mind. Vanessa smiled faintly, adjusting her scarf as a gust of wind tugged at its ends. Then she heard it. A whistle, sharp, purposeful. "Yo, check it," a voice muttered. Her body tensed, her fingers curling into the wool of her coat. Instinctively, she glanced up and saw them, 6 men near the alleyway, lounging against the brick wall like they owned the street. Their postures were loose, but their eyes were sharp. "Damn," one of them chuckled. "She's sick or something?" The words hit like a slap, cutting through her fragile moment of peace. Vanessa lowered her gaze and quickened her pace. "Were you going in a hurry, Auntie?" "Keep walking. Don't look back." Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, pounding like a drum against the inside of her skull. "Keep walking. Don't look back." Just a few more steps, and she'd be past them, beyond whatever this was. She focused on the cracked pavement beneath her shoes, willing her legs to move faster. Then, footsteps. A slow shuffle at first, then quicker, more purposeful. They moved in, closing the space around her before she could react. Her breath hitched. A presence loomed just behind her, too close. "Relax," a voice murmured, smooth, unbothered. Before she could turn, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. Firm. Possessive. Vanessa flinched, her body rigid with instinctive fear. She turned, meeting a wide, lazy grin that sent a cold wave down her spine. Drak. His confidence oozed through the smirk curling at his lips, the kind of arrogance that came with knowing he had nothing to lose and everything to take. "Ain't no need to be rude," he drawled, his voice thick with amusement. "We just want to talk." Behind him, a few of the younger ones shifted, their bravado flickering at the edges. Vanessa forced herself to stand straight, to keep her voice steady. "I don't have anything for you." Drak chuckled, low and dismissive. "Now, that's just not true." A hand darted toward her purse. Reflex took over. She yanked it back, clutching it to her side. Her fingers tightened around the worn leather, knuckles whitening. "Come on, man," one of the younger gang members muttered under his breath, his voice wavered, almost reluctant. She ain't even got hair, man." The words hung in the air like an exposed nerve. Vanessa saw it then, hesitation. Uncertainty. The boy looked at her, really looked, then flicked his gaze toward Drock. Drock's easy smirk faltered. His eyes darkened, sharpening like the edge of a blade. "She ain't got hair, so what?" he snapped, turning his full attention to the younger one. His voice, once playful, now carried an edge of challenge. "That means she ain't got money?" He took a step closer, shoulders squared. "You soft now?" Silence thickened between them, stretching unbearably. The younger one dropped his gaze, lips pressing into a thin, uneasy line. Vanessa's fingers trembled where they clutched the strap of her bag. The cold air bit at her exposed skin, but the chill running through her had nothing to do with the weather. She swallowed hard. "Please," she whispered, the word barely escaping her lips. For a second, no one moved. Then, Drock shoved her hard. She stumbled, her shoulder slamming into the rough brick wall. Pain flared up her side, sharp and immediate, knocking the breath from her lungs. She barely had time to recover before another hand yanked at her purse, the force jerking her forward. She clung to the strap, her fingers burning as it was ripped from her grasp. The sting shot through her palm, and she gasped, clutching her wrist as if that could somehow stop the tremors in her hands. One of the younger ones, the hesitant one, shifted uneasily. His sneakers scuffed against the pavement as he took a small step back. "Yo, we don't need to." Drock's head snapped toward him, his expression darkening. His voice was sharp, cutting through the moment like a blade. "You got something to say?" A pause, heavy with tension. The younger one's lips parted, but he hesitated too long. "Nah," he mumbled, eyes dropping to the ground. Vanessa barely had time to brace herself before another shove sent her sprawling. This time, there was no wall to catch her. The pavement was unforgiving, cold, hard, unyielding. Her knee scraped against the rough concrete, and she landed on her side, the shock of the impact leaving her momentarily dazed. The chill of the ground seeped into her skin, its unforgiving surface pressing against her cheek. Drock crouched beside her, his presence looming, his breath warm against the cold air. There was something in his eyes, something sharp and cruel. A flicker of satisfaction. He reached forward. She flinched, expecting another blow, but instead, his fingers curled around the edge of her scarf. Without hesitation, he yanked it away. The cold air hit her bare scalp. Silence. A shift in energy. One of them moved, barely perceptible discomfort creeping into his stance. "She got cancer, man," someone muttered. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. "So?" Drock scoffed, his voice laced with amusement, and something meaner underneath. "Y'all feel bad now? Man, y'all weak as hell." His sneer deepened as he straightened up, brushing off his jeans, like this whole thing was just another routine. "She still got money, don't she?" No one answered. Vanessa lay curled in on herself, gripping her ribs as sharp, ragged breaths escaped her lips. Every inhale sent a fresh wave of pain rippling through her chest. She couldn't fight back. She couldn't even move without agony flaring through her body. All she could do was stay there, pressed against the unforgiving pavement, waiting for it to be over. Vanessa barely had time to brace herself before another shove sent her sprawling. This time, there was no wall to catch her. The pavement was unforgiving, cold, hard, unyielding. Her knee scraped against the rough concrete, and she landed on her side. The shock of the impact left her momentarily dazed. The chill of the ground seeped into her skin, pressing against her cheek. Drak crouched beside her, his presence looming, his breath warm against the cold air. There was something in his eyes, something sharp and cruel, a flicker of satisfaction. He reached forward. She flinched, expecting another blow, but instead, his fingers curled around the edge of her scarf. Without hesitation, he yanked it away. The cold air hit her bare scalp. Silence. A shift in energy. One of them moved, barely perceptible discomfort creeping into his stance. "She got cancer, man," someone muttered. The words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. "So?" Drak scoffed, his voice laced with amusement, and something meaner underneath. "Y'all feel bad now? Man, y'all weak as hell." His sneer deepened as he straightened up, brushing off his jeans like this whole thing was just another routine. "She still got money, don't she?" No one answered. Vanessa lay curled in on herself, gripping her ribs as sharp, ragged breaths escaped her lips. Every inhale sent a fresh wave of pain rippling through her chest. She couldn't fight back. She couldn't even move without agony flaring through her body. All she could do was stay there, pressed against the unforgiving pavement, waiting for it to be over. Somewhere above her, footsteps shuffled, the sound of sneakers scuffing against concrete. Some of them were leaving. Some, but not all. And then, Drak's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Cold. Final. Nah. We ain't done." Vanessa's stomach twisted. She forced herself onto her hands and knees, desperate to push herself up, to get away, to do something. But before she could rise, pain exploded in her side. A boot crashed into her ribs, knocking the breath clean out of her lungs. A sharp, agonizing crack tore through her, splintering her senses. She barely registered the pavement slamming against her back as she crumpled, choking on a strangled cry of pain. "Damn," someone muttered, their voice edged with uncertainty. "Yo, Jay, we got what we came for, man." "Shut the hell up," Drak snapped. His tone was different this time, sharper, laced with irritation. He crouched down beside her again, his shadow stretching over her, swallowing what little light was left. He was enjoying this. Dragging it out. Making sure she knew he had the power here. Vanessa clenched her jaw, her hands curling into fists as she fought back the burn behind her eyes. "Don't cry. Don't give him that." She wouldn't let him see her break. Slowly, she turned her head, forcing herself to look at them, to see their faces. Some of them wouldn't meet her eyes. Some looked away, shifting uncomfortably, their postures rigid with unease. The one who had spoken earlier, the hesitant one, stood stiffly with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Leon." She thought she had heard one of them call him that. His jaw was tight. His gaze flickered between her and Drak. There was something in his expression, a hesitation, a quiet battle behind his eyes. Like he wanted to speak, but knew better. Like he wanted to stop this but didn't know how. She latched onto that hesitation, grasping it like a lifeline. Doubt lingered in some of them. It was subtle, a quiet discomfort shifting beneath their bravado. But it was there. Not all of them wanted this. Not all of them were like him. Drak, however, had no hesitation. No second thoughts. No flicker of remorse. He was the kind of man who enjoyed power. Who reveled in it. His fingers twisted into the fabric of her coat, tightening around the collar as he yanked her upward, just enough to force her to face him. His grip was like iron, digging into the warm material, pressing against her skin. His breath hit her face. Warm and sour, thick with the sharp bite of cheap liquor and stale cigarettes. Look at you, he sneered, his voice laced with cruel amusement. All week. You ever think about just giving up? Vanessa didn't answer. She wouldn't give him that. His fingers flexed against her collar, pulling her just a little closer. I asked you a question, his voice was low now, dangerous. Daring her to defy him. Pain rippled through her body, but she refused to look away. Her jaw clenched, her breathing shallow and uneven. Slowly, she met his gaze, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. And I'm not answering. For a second, just a second, his expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe. Surprise. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. His hand moved. Fast. Too fast for her to react. The back of his palm struck her across the face with brutal force, snapping her head to the side. A burst of white-hot pain exploded behind her eyes. The world tilted, blurred at the edges. And before she could catch herself, she was falling again. The pavement was unforgiving. The impact rattled through her bones. Man, come on, Leon muttered, his voice barely above a breath. She already down. Drock's head snapped toward him, his glare sharp enough to cut. The hell you saying? Leon's shoulders tensed. For a second, he looked like he might back down. But then he squared his jaw, forcing himself to speak. I just mean, she ain't fighting back. We did what we came to do. His voice wavered, uncertainty flickering beneath the surface. But the words were out now, standing between them like a challenge. Drock studied him, his expression darkening, unreadable. The air grew thick with something unspoken. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Aight, he said, pushing himself up, brushing off his hands like this had been nothing more than a chore. We done. Vanessa didn't move. Didn't breathe. She stayed perfectly still, listening. Waiting. Footsteps shuffled away. Some quick, eager to leave. One pair hesitated. Then followed. She didn't look up until the last of them had disappeared. Silence. The kind that felt too big, stretching out endlessly around her. For a long moment, she simply lay there, staring up at the empty sky. The deep, dark blue stretched overhead, distant and indifferent. As if none of this had happened. As if she were nothing more than another piece of the cold pavement beneath her. Her ribs ached with every breath. Her face throbbed where Drock's hand had struck. But the worst pain wasn't in her body. It was deeper. Settling somewhere inside her. Twisting like a knife. This place, her home, no longer felt safe. The streets she had walked for years, the sidewalks worn with familiarity, now felt foreign. Like they belonged to someone else. The air was thick, pressing in around her, heavy with something she couldn't quite name. She sucked in a shaky breath, her chest tightening as pain lanced through her ribs. The sting in her eyes burned. But she refused to let the tears fall. Not here. Not now. Slowly, carefully, she rolled onto her side, her body protesting every movement. Fire shot through her ribs with each inch she gained, but she gritted her teeth, jaw locked against the pain. There was no other choice. Giving in wasn't an option. Vanessa staggered as she pushed herself upright, her balance unsteady. She needed to get home. That was the only thought that mattered. Home. She didn't notice the blood at the corner of her mouth, the dark smear against her skin. She didn't notice the way her body hunched forward protectively, as if bracing for another blow. She didn't even notice the quiet set of eyes watching from a nearby doorway, lingering, hesitant. She just walked. Step by step. Home. The moment Mark Williams pulled into the driveway, he knew something was wrong. It wasn't anything obvious, no broken windows, no signs of a struggle. But it was in the stillness. In the way the house seemed to hold its breath. Usually, there was life here. Music playing from the kitchen. The soft hum of the TV drifting from the living room. The subtle sounds of a home lived in. But tonight, there was only silence. His gut tightened. He shut off the engine and stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. The air had turned colder since the morning, crisp with the bite of approaching winter. But the chill that ran down his spine had nothing to do with the weather. Something wasn't right. Mark unlocked the front door and stepped inside, his senses on high alert. "Vanessa?" His voice was calm. Steady. Controlled. No answer. His gaze swept the living room, empty. A half-full glass of water sat on the coffee table, untouched. The condensation gathered in a small ring beneath it. The coat she usually hung neatly by the door was crumpled on the floor, discarded carelessly. That wasn't like her. His pulse ticked up as he moved through the house, his footsteps purposeful, but quiet. Then he heard it. Water running. His head turned toward the bathroom, where a thin stream of steam curled from the cracked doorway, bleeding into the dim hallway light. Mark approached quietly, pushing the door open just enough to see her. Vanessa stood at the sink, a damp washcloth pressed against her cheek. Her scarf lay neatly folded on the counter beside her, untouched. But her hands trembled as she dabbed at her skin. The deep purple bruise blooming along her jaw made his breath catch, a slow-burning rage igniting in his chest, sharp and violent. She didn't flinch when he stepped inside. Didn't even look up. His voice, when he spoke, was low. Measured. Controlled only by force. "Who did this?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. She just kept scrubbing at a spot on her arm, her fingers moving in slow, desperate circles. As if she could scrub away what had happened. As if she could erase it from her skin. From her mind. But no matter how much pressure she applied, no matter how raw her skin became, the feeling wouldn't leave. The dirt. The fear. It was still there, buried deep beneath the surface. Vanessa. Mark's reflection appeared beside hers in the mirror, his gaze steady. Searching. He didn't speak again. Didn't push her for an answer. But the way he looked at her. Like he could see right through the act, right through the mask she was barely holding together, made her chest tighten. Her lip trembled, just slightly. Then, her shoulders sagged, and she finally let go. The words spilled out, shaky at first, then all at once. Everything. The gang. The shoving. The laughter. Drock. How some of them had hesitated when they saw she was sick. But how that hadn't stopped them. How nothing had stopped them. Her voice wavered as she spoke, but she forced herself to say it all. To let him hear what had been done to her. By the time she finished, Mark's fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His face remained unreadable. His expression calm. Controlled. But Vanessa knew him. She could see it. The fury simmering just beneath his skin, coiled like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. His breathing was even. Measured. But there was tension in every inch of him. In the rigid set of his jaw. In the way his chest rose just a little too sharply with every breath. Then, slowly, he exhaled, forcing his fingers to uncurl. Willing his voice to soften. "Come here." She hesitated. Only for a second. Then stepped into his arms. The moment his arms wrapped around her, She pressed her face into his chest, her body sinking into his warmth. His steady heartbeat beneath her cheek. "I got you," he murmured against her hair, his voice quiet but firm. "I promise you, baby. I got you." Vanessa nodded, the movement small, barely there. But she didn't ask him what he meant. Because she already knew. Mark helped her to bed, his movements careful, almost reverent, as he tucked the blanket around her, smoothing the fabric as if afraid she might break. He lingered. His palm rested against the scarf covering her head, his thumb brushing over the edge before he finally pulled away. She was already fading into sleep, exhaustion pulling her under. Then, without a sound, he stepped out of the room and pulled out his phone. First call. Detective Lisa Monroe. She picked up on the third ring, her voice laced with familiarity, but also fatigue. "Williams," she greeted. "What's up?" Mark's grip tightened around the phone. "My wife was attacked." His voice was flat. Cold. A pause. Then, Monroe's breath hitched, the sharp intake barely audible over the line. "You serious? Would I be calling if I wasn't?" Another pause. This one heavier. Then, the shift. The tone he recognized. The professional one. The one that meant she was already moving. Already putting the pieces together in her mind. Where? When? Mark gave her the details. Every word clipped. Precise. The names. The location. What they took. Monroe was silent for a moment. Then she sighed. "Listen," she said carefully, threading caution between her words. "I'll put in the report and push it through. But I gotta be real with you, Drock's got ties. Not just to the streets, but to some people who'd rather not see him locked up. This case might not move fast." Mark's grip on the phone tightened. His fingers flexed around the smooth surface. His jaw locked, the muscle ticking as he forced himself to breathe through the frustration clawing at his chest. When he spoke, his voice was low. Steady. But the weight behind it was unmistakable. "It'll move fast." Monroe heard it. The edge in his tone. The quiet threat laced between the words. "Mark," she warned, her voice firm, controlled, but edged with something close to concern. "Don't do this. Let me handle it." His response came too quickly. Too easily. "I am letting you handle it." A pause. Then, just as evenly. "For now." Monroe cursed under her breath, frustration bleeding through the line. "Damn it, Williams. I know that tone." The call ended. Mark sat in the dark for a long time. Staring at the floor. Listening to the quiet hum of the house around him. The air was thick with stillness. The kind that came after something broke. His mind drifted back to the man he used to be. The man he had spent years burying. A soldier. A weapon. A man who knew how to make things disappear. He had left that life behind. Built something different with Vanessa. Something steady. Something real. A life not defined by violence. But now, that life felt like an illusion. If the cops wouldn't move fast, he would. Drock and his people thought they ran these streets. Thought they could do what they wanted without consequence. They had no idea who they just crossed. Mark sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic pattern against the wooden surface. The dim light overhead cast long, stretching shadows across the room, the glow from the screen reflecting in his eyes. He wasn't just angry. Anger was reckless. Impulsive. He was past that. He was calculating. Vanessa was asleep in the next room, her breathing soft and even. But Mark wouldn't rest. Not now. Not until he had what he needed. Names. Locations. A plan. His mind was already working, dissecting every detail, every possibility, every weak spot in Drock's operation. He started with the basics. Local gang activity. Known associates. Prior arrests. Drock wasn't just some street thug shaking people down for pocket change. He had a network. A reputation. And reputations weren't invincible. They could be dismantled, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but fear and ruin. The police database was off limits. But Mark didn't need official records. He had his own sources. People who owed him. People who understood the value of information. Without hesitation, he reached for his phone and dialed. The call barely rang before a voice answered on the first ring. Williams. A pause. A slight shift in tone. It's been a while. Too long, Mark muttered, his voice low. Clipped. I need intel on a crew out here. Drock's people. You got anything on them? The man on the other end exhaled slowly, the sound of hesitation clear even through the phone. That's a dangerous name to be asking about. Mark didn't respond. He didn't need to. Silence had a way of making people uncomfortable. Of pressing down until they felt the weight of it. Sure enough, the voice on the other end filled the empty space. Runs low-level street stuff. Drugs, weapons, intimidation. Police don't touch him much, either too scared or too paid off. Mark's fingers tapped lightly against the table, his expression unreadable. That all? A sigh came through the line, followed by a pause, like the man on the other end was debating whether to say more. There's a kid in his crew. Leon Harris. Young. Not deep in the life yet. Might be the only one with a conscience. That was enough. A crack in the armor. A weak link in the chain. Appreciate it, Mark said, his voice flat. Final. He ended the call without another word. Finding a gang member in this city wasn't difficult. They moved in patterns. Predictable routines. They thought it made them invisible. But it only made them easier to track. Same streets. Same habits. Same spots where they felt untouchable. You just had to watch long enough. Mark parked down the street from a rundown liquor store. Engine off. Hands resting on the wheel. Scanning the sidewalk with the practiced eye of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Leon was there, just like he expected. Shoulders hunched, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, standing just outside the weak glow of a flickering streetlight. He wasn't posturing like the others. Wasn't laughing. Wasn't trying to prove anything. He looked uncomfortable. Out of place. That made things easier. Mark stepped out of the car, his movements efficient. Purposeful. No hesitation. No wasted energy. The moment Leon sensed someone approaching, he turned slightly. But he barely had time to react before Mark was beside him, gripping his arm in a way that looked casual, just two men talking on the sidewalk, but felt like a warning. Leon stiffened instantly. Yo. Walk, Mark ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Leon hesitated. I don't. The pressure on his arm increased. Just enough to send a message. Walk. Leon swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing, and moved. Mark guided him away from the sidewalk, down the narrow space between two buildings where the light didn't reach. Not completely out of sight, but out of reach of prying eyes. Enough privacy to have the conversation Mark needed to have. Once they were alone, Mark let go. But his stance didn't shift. He didn't need to loom over the kid. His presence alone was enough to make Leon uneasy. "I know who you run with," Mark said, his voice even. Steady. "I know what happened yesterday." Leon shifted his weight, his sneakers scraping against the pavement. His gaze flicked toward the mouth of the alley, like he was calculating his odds of running. Mark saw it before he even moved. And took a step forward, cutting off the exit. Without a word. Leon sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, shaking his head. "Man, I don't want no trouble." "Then don't make any." Mark's voice was cold. Sharp. Giving nothing away. "Tell me about Drock." Leon exhaled sharply, his breath shaky. Uneven. His shoulders tensed. His body language screamed hesitation. "I can't, man." His voice wavered. "If he finds out I've been talking." He cut himself off. Shaking his head. Already regretting saying too much. "He won't," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "Not if you're smart." Leon rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His fingers twitched. His foot tapped restlessly against the pavement. He was scared. And for good reason. But fear made people talk just as much as it made them stay quiet. "Look," Leon started, his voice lower now. As if saying it out loud made it worse. "I didn't even want to be there. Some of us." He hesitated, glancing away before finally admitting the truth. "We didn't want to mess with your wife. We saw she was sick, man. We ain't heartless." Mark's jaw clenched, his hands curling into loose fists at his sides. But he forced himself to stay still. To listen. To wait. Leon let out another breath, frustration mixing with fear. "Drock don't care about none of that. He says we do what we're told. No exceptions." His voice dropped. His posture shrinking. "And if we don't?" Mark didn't need him to finish the sentence. He knew exactly what came next. Men like Drock only held power through fear. Through control. Through making sure that stepping out of line had consequences. Leon hesitated again. Then muttered. "But not all of us are like that." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Leon licked his lips, eyes darting toward the alley entrance before he sighed. "Devin and Marcus. They ain't like the others. They don't want to be in this any more than I do." His voice lowered, like he wasn't sure if he should be saying this. "Drock keeps them in check. The same way he does the rest of us. Fear. But if they saw a way out." Mark considered that. He wasn't looking for recruits. But knowing who in the gang wasn't loyal could be useful. "They just following orders," Leon continued. "They ain't the ones making the calls." Mark gave a slow nod, filing the information away. He studied Leon for a long moment. Leon swallowed hard. His jaw worked. His mind raced through possibilities. Through outcomes. Through what happened if he gave up the wrong name. Then, finally, he sighed. Shoulders sagging under the weight of inevitability. "If you go after Drock, man." Leon's voice was quiet. "But be careful." Mark's gaze didn't waver. He got more than just gangbangers. Leon's fingers twitched. He got connections. Mark gave a single nod. His face unreadable. His tone final. So do I. Mark didn't respond right away. He simply studied Leon, his expression unreadable, his posture steady. The weight of his presence pressed down on the younger man, making it clear that this wasn't a negotiation. Leon swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he shifted uncomfortably. "Man, I don't know about this," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "You don't get it. Drock, he don't just let people walk away." Mark tilted his head slightly. "Then it's a good thing I'm not asking for permission." Leon let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "You don't understand how this works. You think taking out a couple of his guys means he's just gonna back down?" He scoffed, but there was no real confidence behind it. "Man, Drock's gonna come at you harder." Mark's voice remained calm, steady. "Let him." Leon let out a short, bitter laugh. "You crazy, man." Mark took a step closer, his eyes locking onto Leon's. "No," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of finality. "I'm just not afraid of him." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Leon exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You got no idea what you're starting." Mark's lips curled slightly, a ghost of something that might have been a smile. "I know exactly what I'm starting. The question is, are you in or not?" Leon hesitated. His fingers twitched at his sides, his shoulders tense. Then, finally, he let out a slow breath. "I'm in." Mark gave a single nod. "Good." He turned, starting to walk away. "Wait." Mark paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Leon ran a hand over his head, exhaling. "If you're serious about this, you need to know, Drock's got a weapons shipment coming in. Big one. That's how he keeps control. If you want to shake him, that's where you start." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. "When?" "Tomorrow night. Auto shop by the docks." "Late." Mark filed the information away. "And you?" Leon shifted. "I ain't deep enough in to be at that meeting, but I know who will be. If you want names, I can get them." Mark nodded. "Do it." Leon hesitated for only a second before exhaling. "All right." Without another word, Mark turned and disappeared into the night. By the next evening, Mark had everything he needed. The warehouse was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a flickering bulb overhead and the glow of streetlights filtering through broken windows. The air was thick with the scent of oil and dust, the quiet murmur of men who had until recently called Drock their leader filling the space. Mark stood at the center, his arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over the room. Leon was leaning against a stack of crates, his posture tense but steady. Trey and Marcus sat nearby, both looking uncertain but determined. "You all know why we're here," Mark said, his voice calm but firm. "Drock runs the city through fear. That ends tonight." Trey exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "The pit ain't built like the auto shop. Place is open. Lot of exits. If we don't move right, we lose him." Mark nodded. "Then we make sure he has nowhere to go." They laid out the plan. Phase 1, isolate the club. The pit had multiple entrances, a main door, a side alley, and a back exit leading to a loading dock. Drock had used it to move product in and out without drawing attention. That would be his first escape route. They'd cut it off. Phase 2, controlled the inside. Leon and a few of the others still had ties inside. They could walk in without raising suspicion, positioning themselves before the action started. Drock's men were already wary, already questioning things. They just needed the right push. Phase 3, take him down. Drock thrives in chaos, Mark said, his voice level. But only when he's the one controlling it. We take that away, he won't have time to think, only to react. And that's when he makes mistakes. The plan was simple. Execution would be everything. Mark's gaze swept the room, letting the silence stretch. You don't have to do this, he said finally. Drock's losing power, but he's still dangerous. If any of you want to walk away, do it now. No one moved. Leon smirked, shaking his head. Ain't nobody walking away, man. Not after everything. That was all Mark needed to hear. The pit was alive, music thumping through the walls, men coming and going without realizing the walls were closing in around them. Mark stood outside, watching from a distance as Leon and the others slipped inside, blending in as they positioned themselves. A truck rumbled down the street, slowing as it neared the back entrance. That was their team, moving into place, cutting off Drock's easiest way out. Every piece was falling into position. Mark adjusted his grip on his jacket, his mind calm, despite the tension crackling in the air. He had been in situations like this before, waiting for the right moment. Knowing that once it came, there was no going back. Trey's voice came over the earpiece they had rigged together from burner phones. We're in. He's at his usual spot. Back booth near the bar. Got 2 of his guys close. Mark's pulse remained steady. Wait for my signal. From his position, he could see the club's reflection in the glass window across the street. The night was alive, unaware that within minutes, everything inside was about to change. A slow inhale. A steady exhale. This was it. Inside, the pit was thick with cigarette smoke, the scent of sweat and cheap liquor mixing into a heavy fog. The crowd was dense, bodies moving to the rhythm of the music, some lost in conversation, while others watched everything around them with the quiet suspicion that came with living on the edge of violence. Drock sat in his usual booth near the back, one arm draped over the worn leather seat, his fingers tapping idly against his knee. A drink sat untouched in front of him, condensation pooling at the base of the glass. But his eyes weren't on the drink. They were scanning the room. Waiting. He knew something was coming. But he was looking for the wrong threat. Near the bar, Leon leaned against the counter, head low, blending into the crowd. He had been inside for nearly 20 minutes, long enough to get a read on the energy in the room. Drock's men were tense. Some were drinking more than usual. Others were speaking in hushed tones, their eyes flickering toward their boss every few seconds. Leon caught Trey's glance from across the room. Everything was set. He pressed his phone once, sending a silent signal to Mark outside. Mark stood in the alley beside the club, his breathing slow, measured. He could feel the energy inside. The moment of stillness before everything shattered. He turned his head slightly, signaling the men near the back entrance. They moved into place without a word, blocking the loading dock. Drock would try to escape. And they would be waiting. Then, without hesitation, Mark pushed the door open and stepped inside. The shift in the room was subtle at first. A slow ripple of recognition as people glanced toward the entrance, their minds taking a moment to register what they were seeing. Mark didn't belong here. And everyone knew it. Drock's fingers stopped tapping. The tension in the air snapped tight. Mark walked forward with calm, unhurried steps, his expression unreadable. The crowd instinctively parted as he moved, uncertainty creeping into their faces. The weight of his presence was enough to stir unease. He wasn't posturing. Wasn't trying to make a scene. He simply existed in a way that made it clear. He wasn't afraid. Drock's grip tightened on the armrest. You lost? His voice carried through the space, casual, but with an undercurrent of warning. Mark stopped a few feet from the booth. He let the silence settle. Let the weight of his presence sink into the room. Then, his voice, calm and even. You know why I'm here. Drock chuckled, shaking his head slightly. You got some nerve walking in here like you run the place. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. You think just 'cause you took out a few of my guys, you untouchable? Mark didn't respond. Instead, he let his eyes sweep the room, noting the small shifts, men adjusting their weight, hands twitching toward weapons. Some of them weren't fully committed to moving yet. Hesitation. That was the key. You built this place on fear, Mark said finally, his voice just loud enough to be heard over the music. That worked for a while. But fear doesn't last. You know that. Drock's smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second. Mark took another step forward. You feel it, don't you? He continued. Your people slipping through your fingers. You're holding on so tight, you can't even see how many have already let go. A muscle in Drock's jaw twitched. He glanced toward the bar, toward the shadows where Leon stood. His lips parted slightly, realizing just how many of his own men weren't standing with him anymore. For the first time, Mark saw doubt flicker in his eyes. It lasted only a moment before Drock pushed himself to his feet, rolling his shoulders, shaking off whatever uncertainty had crept in. You think you can just walk in here, throw some words around, and I'll just roll over? His voice was louder now, cutting through the room. You think I don't know who I'm dealing with? His gaze hardened. I ain't scared of you. Mark didn't blink. You should be. Drock's hand moved. It was instinct, reaching for the gun tucked beneath his jacket. The kind of motion that came from years of living in a world where survival was dictated by who pulled the trigger first. But Mark was faster. Before Drock could draw his weapon, Mark closed the distance, grabbing his wrist in a brutal twisting motion that forced the gun free. It clattered against the table, sliding across the floor. The room exploded. Drock's men surged forward, some out of loyalty, others out of panic. Leon and the others moved just as fast, intercepting them before they could reach Mark. Fists cracked against jaws. Bodies collided against tables and chairs. Glass shattered against the floor. Mark didn't focus on the chaos around him. His grip was locked around Drock's arm, twisting him forward, slamming him onto the table with enough force to rattle the bottles on it. Drock struggled, elbow swinging back, catching Mark's ribs. But Mark didn't let go. He wrenched him upright, spun him around, and drove him backward against the wall. The music was still blaring. But the fight was already shifting. The ones who had turned against Drock weren't just fighting. They were winning. Drock knew it too. Mark could see it in his eyes, the realization that for the first time, he wasn't in control anymore. The chaos inside the pit had reached its peak. Fists cracked against jaws. Tables overturned. Glass shattered against the concrete floor. Drock's men, the ones still loyal enough or too afraid to turn, were losing ground. The balance had shifted. Leon and the others fought with a determination that came from knowing they were free of Drock's grip the moment he fell. But Mark wasn't focused on them. His world had narrowed to the man in front of him. Drock had shoved away from the wall, staggering but still standing. His face twisted in rage, the glint of sweat catching under the neon glow of the club lights. He rolled his shoulders, his breath heavy, and eyed Mark like a cornered animal ready to bite. "You think you something special?" Drock sneered, wiping a trail of blood from the corner of his mouth. "Think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?" Mark didn't answer. He didn't waste words on men like Drock. The fight wasn't over. Drock moved first, lunging forward, his fist swinging in a wild arc. It was meant to be fast. Unpredictable. But Mark had seen real combat. He knew what a desperate man looked like in a fight. And Drock was nothing if not desperate. Mark sidestepped at the last second, the punch barely grazing his shoulder. Before Drock could recover, Mark delivered a sharp, precise strike to his ribs. Drock grunted in pain. But instead of stepping back, he used the momentum to drive his knee up, aiming for Mark's gut. Mark caught the movement too late. The impact landed hard, knocking the air from his lungs, sending him stumbling back a step. Drock smirked, breathing heavy. "That all you got?" Mark didn't reply. Instead, he surged forward, grabbing Drock by the front of his jacket and slamming him into the nearest table. The cheap wood splintered under the weight, sending drinks and broken glass flying. Drock lashed out, his fist connecting with Mark's jaw. Pain exploded across Mark's face. But he didn't loosen his grip. He could feel Drock trying to squirm free, trying to slip away. Mark responded by grabbing the back of his head and driving his skull into the table surface. Once. Twice. Just enough to rattle his bones. Drock spat blood, groaning as he pushed himself off the wreckage. He was slower now. His movements sluggish. But there was still fight. Mark didn't give him the chance. He grabbed Drock's wrist before he could pull the weapon free, twisting it sharply. A sickening pop echoed between them, followed by a strangled scream. Drock's knees buckled. Mark wrenched his arm further, forcing him to the ground. "You're done," Mark said, his voice steady. Drock gritted his teeth, sweat dripping down his forehead. "You don't get it," he panted, his breath uneven. "There ain't no done in this life. You take me out, someone else steps up. That's how it works." Mark tightened his grip. "Not this time." Drock let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head even as he knelt on the ground, broken and bleeding. "So what, you gonna kill me now? That the plan?" Mark's fingers flexed. His instincts screamed at him to finish it. He had fought men like Drock before. Men who ruled through violence and fear. Men who never changed. If he ended this here, no one would blame him. The world would be better without Drock in it. But that wasn't justice. That was vengeance. And vengeance wouldn't bring Vanessa peace. Mark let out a slow breath, before releasing Drock's wrist and stepping back. Drock looked up, his body wrecked, his pride shattered. Disbelief flickered across his face. He had been expecting the killing blow. The final end. Instead, Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Drock's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "You serious?" Mark didn't answer as he dialed. 911, what's your emergency? Mark kept his eyes locked on Drock as he spoke. "I have a man here wanted for multiple assaults, drug trafficking, and attempted murder." You're gonna want to send backup. Drock let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Man, cops ain't gonna keep me locked up. You know how this works. Mark gave him a knowing look. Not this time. The sirens were already closing in. The moment Drock's own men had realized the fight was lost, they had scattered, slipping into the night like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The pit was emptying fast, leaving only those too injured to run and those too loyal or too stupid to know when to quit. Drock sighed, defeated, as he slumped against the floor, his head rolling back against the broken table leg. Guess you won, huh? He muttered. Mark didn't answer. He already knew the truth. The flashing red and blue lights painted the crumbling walls of the pit, casting long shadows as officers moved through the wreckage of the fight. The air was thick with the lingering scent of sweat, alcohol, and blood. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor, some groaning in pain, others too exhausted or beaten to move. The music had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence, broken only by the static of police radios and the occasional barked command. Mark stood just outside the club's entrance, his body still tense, his knuckles bruised, his jaw tight. Monroe approached him, her badge clipped to her belt, her expression unreadable. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms. You got any idea how much paperwork this is gonna take? Mark let out a slow breath. He's off the streets, isn't he? Monroe studied him for a moment, then shook her head with a quiet sigh. You're lucky you're not in cuffs yourself, Williams. Mark didn't say anything. She glanced over her shoulder as officers dragged Drock toward a waiting squad car, his hands cuffed behind his back. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his posture. No smirk on his lips. Just silence. Monroe turned back to Mark. He's gonna talk, she said. People like him always do when they realize they're not getting out of this one. Mark gave a small nod. Good. Monroe exhaled, shaking her head again. You know, I should be arresting you for what you did tonight. Mark met her gaze. Then why aren't you? She studied him for a long moment before responding. Because for the first time in a long time, I think justice actually won. Mark didn't answer. She turned, walking back toward the chaos, barking orders to her officers. Mark stayed where he was for a few more moments, letting the weight of everything settle over him. Then, finally, he turned and walked away. When Mark stepped into the house, the silence was different this time. Not heavy. Not suffocating. Just peaceful. Vanessa was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea resting on the coffee table in front of her. She looked up the moment he walked in, her eyes searching his face. He didn't say anything. Just crossed the room, sat beside her, and pulled her into his arms. She sank into him, her body fitting against his in a way that felt right. Safe. Mark pressed a slow kiss to the top of her head, breathing her in. It's over, he murmured. Vanessa let out a shaky breath, her fingers tightening around his shirt. You're sure, she whispered. Mark nodded. Yeah. A pause. Then, softly. He can't hurt you anymore. Vanessa let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. And as Mark held her close, the weight of everything slowly fading into the quiet hum of the night, she finally believed it. The end.